I'm very glad to have Professor FRASER to have a talk for us. As you might all know, Chris is a chair at UT, one of the most prestigious chair professorship within Chinese philosophy and culture. And Chris also, of course, published very widely in early China and has the latest book by author in late classical Chinese thought, covering, I think, also part of like legalists and Xúnzǐ and Xúnzǐ like that. And of course, he is also an expert in Mozi and Zhuangzi. So without further ado, please join us in welcoming Chris.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. I'm delighted to return to Hong Kong and to return to HKU, and thank you very much for inviting me to come. So what I want to talk about today is what I read as a critique of legalism or the underlying ideas of legalism in Xúnzǐ. And Xúnzǐ is often not read this way, but I tend to read Xúnzǐ as speaking toward many of the ideas of the 3rd century BC, including a lot of the ideas that are associated with legalism or that people were discussing that ended up being incorporated into what we think of as legalism. Okay, so famously, everyone has heard this famous line from Xúnzǐ. Xúnzǐ says, 有治人无治法. Right? There are persons who produce good order. There are no standards or laws that automatically produce good order. 法不能独立，类不能自省. Right? So, 法 can't stand on their own. The normatively relevant kind distinctions that we use to guide action don't just operate on their own. You have to have the right people in place in order to preserve them and apply them in the appropriate way. Okay, and he also says of the legalist figure Xúnzǐ, that Xúnzǐ was blinkered or obscured by standards such that he failed to recognize the importance of moral worth or moral qualities. Now, those remarks on the relation between Fa, standards, institutionalized standards, and people, personal qualities, moral character, ended up inspiring a series of discussions over the years in the development of traditional Chinese political thought. And what piqued my interest and got me to look into this was that I realized that some of these later figures, such as Hu Hong and Huang Zongxi, are actually quoting Xúnzǐ and talking about the ideas that are introduced in Xúnzǐ when they are treating the issue of institutional standards for thought. So what I'm going to talk about today then is I'm just going to briefly sketch how Xúnzǐ and several later thinkers explore the role of personal virtue in the functioning of institutional standards. And to give you a preview of some of the things that I'm going to say, I'm going to suggest that Ruist Discourse on Fa offers us fundamental, profound insights into the functioning of standards, laws, and institutions. In other words, the discourse introduced by Xúnzǐ should have a prominent, important role in global discussion of concepts such as rule of law. The Xúnzǐ is offering us very, very deep insights into rule of law, which are picked up and developed in various ways by later thinkers in the Ruist tradition. Xúnzǐ identifies basic constraints on any system of rule and management by explicit guidelines. It could be laws, it could be the rules of a university, it could be the rules of a soccer game. Whatever it is, if you've got some sort of institutionalized standard, you're going to have to pay attention to some of the basic ideas that are presented in Xúnzǐ and then developed in the later Ruist tradition. And so by extension then, what I'd suggest is that Ruist discourse on character, moral culture, and the interrelations with the functioning of institutions helps to explain contemporary failures of institutions. So the emphasis in the Ruist tradition on the role of personal character remains relevant. And this is neglected in contemporary philosophy of law, I think. And so I would say there's even a practical application, which I'm not going to say very much about today, but we could suggest that Ruist discourse provides plausible starting points for sustaining and improving the functioning of laws and institutions. Now, I don't want to suggest by any means that it gives us some sort of complete, application package that we can take and just apply to talk about how to improve the functioning of institutions. I think it's much more complicated than that. There are many questions and challenges, but it provides us with some inspiration, and it points out some features of the functioning of institutions that we need to pay attention to. Okay, now when I'm talking about legalism, I'm going to be taking a somewhat different approach to it from what you might have read in like a basic textbook, for example. So when we teach, when we teach legalism in an introduction to Chinese philosophy, kind of the standard way to do it, if you want to give a 45-minute lecture, is you talk about you talk about these three concepts, you explain what they are, you say a few words about how they're related to each other, you talk about how Han Fei emphasizes those three and gives credit for them to some of his predecessors, and you've got a pretty good introduction to Fajia right there. Well, I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. That is a way of introducing legalism that reflects the content of the texts. But I want to enhance our understanding of legalism by working from a different perspective. And what I find is that if we read through various political texts of the 3rd century BC, the late pre-imperial period, and in particular, if we pay due attention to neglected texts such as Lü Shi Chun Qiu and a lot of the material in Guanzi, what we find is that there's a deep concern with the concept of gong, impartiality, across a number of texts. And that concern with gong is intertwined with a concern for consistency. And together, those reflect a kind of concern with objectivity, efficacy, and reliability. So why do so-called legalist thinkers focus on the notion of fa, laws or standards or institutional regulations? Well, they're introducing this as a solution to the problem of maintaining impartiality and consistency, gong and chang. So that's why fa comes into the picture. And initially, it really comes into the picture in Mojia, in the Mohists. And ideas of the Mohists introduced are then being developed basically by everybody as we get to the last century of the pre-Han period. So these are widespread themes in the ethical and political discourse of the late warring states. And here's a really nice example. This is an example I'm taking from book 30 of the Guanzi, which is called Juncheng Shang. Okay, book 30 of the Guanzi, if you work on ancient Chinese philosophy or the history of Chinese thought, you should be reading this. This is as important as Xúnzǐ is. No one should neglect this text. It's a very important text. Okay, and pretty much nobody wants to read Guanzi. Now, book 30 of the Guanzi is not a legalist text. I'm not sure how we should categorize it. If you want to, maybe it's Ruist. Set the categories aside. Let's just look at what they have to say. And they say that if a ruler is not gong impartial, he'll regularly be too generous in allocating rewards, too merciful in enforcing punishments. And if the ruler is like that, he doesn't follow some sort of consistent discipline, then the state lacks fa. It doesn't have clear institutional standards. And if in governing a state, you lack standards, then the people will form factions and they'll ally together below. Allying together below is a Mohist concept, right? The Mohists talk a lot about xiabi. And they'll employ devious means to achieve their selfishly biased ends. If the system of standards is constant, then the people are not divided. They join together with their superiors, wholeheartedly devoting their loyalty. Now, the ideas in those several lines would have been shared by many, many political thinkers of the time, regardless of other aspects of their doctrinal orientation. And you can see that in that, just those few lines, we find these 4 key concepts. One is gong, impartiality, or objectivity, or public-mindedness. Impartiality refers to judging and acting in line with open, public, agreed-upon criteria. And that's seen as a requirement for sustainable political rule. So we've got gong contrasts with si. So si is not simply self-interest. Sometimes it's self-interest, but sometimes it's just a kind of bias, acting on your own opinions rather than acting according to some sort of general public objective standard. So it could be self-interested, but not necessarily self-interested. It's just acting on some sort of partial or biased or subjective standpoint. Then you've got the concept of fa, institutional standards. Those are treated as the basis for attaining impartiality. And then you've got this idea of constancy or consistency. The clear, explicit standards must be, on the one hand, the standards have to be enforced consistently. And on the other, if you do enforce them consistently, then you're able to attain a kind of regularity and constancy in rule, in the administration. So you need impartiality to enforce the standards constantly. You need constant enforcement of standards to manifest impartiality, and you need all of those things to avoid bias. So what are the standards that we're talking about? Now, in Western sinology, for years and years, that word fa was consistently interpreted as law. Now, of course, that's not exactly wrong. Fa definitely include laws, but to just directly interpret it as law is problematic because the scope of fa is much broader than law is. And we know from when fa are first introduced in early parts of Guanzi, for instance, they tend to refer to measurement standards. And in the Mozi, of course, they refer to artisans' tools, like the compass, 人规矩, right? So the compass and the square that we use to check whether or not we're actually making a round wheel or a square corner. So initially then, fa are weights, measures, artisans' tools, anything you use as a tool or a standard to check whether or not you've done something right, and also to guide your performance. I don't know how to do it, so I get out my fa, and that helps me to do it. And then there's an extended use where fa are used for guidelines, laws, methods, regulation. And I would say that the use continues to expand a bit. So it comes to refer to any kind of formalized system or method for managing institutions or operations, any kind of benchmark. Anytime you have a benchmark, that's called a fa. And when we get to much later thinkers, like Wu Hong, for instance, he says that the Jing Tian Zhidu, he calls that a fa. Fang Xiaoru says that the role of sages in education and the role of the wealthy in helping the poor, he calls that a fa. So that's more like almost a social custom. Huang Zongxi is pretty clear that he considers land management, the functioning of the schools, marriage customs, how you manage the police force, all of that he considers to be aspects of fa. So fa is an umbrella term for him covering all of these sort of administrative operations. Okay, so back to that text, Juncheng Shang. What we want to emphasize is that it's not a legalist text. It's not a text that emphasizes fa over a whole bunch of other key concepts. Just the contrary, it emphasizes a lot of familiar ethical virtues. So it emphasizes the importance of yi and li, and a number of other virtues. And it assigns a role to moral leadership and moral education in building social coherence and respect for the leadership. And the kind of role that it's applying there is somewhat similar to something we might see in Xúnzǐ, for instance. So it sort of looks like Ruism. It treats ceremonial propriety, li, as a guide to social interaction. It advocates building political unity by earning the respect of the people. It urges the ruler to be flexible and adapt to people's actual circumstances. So it's not what we would normally think of as a so-called legalist text in any way. But if you're going to criticize the position that we find in that text, we might say this. In government, it assigns an important role to moral leadership and moral education. But the process of moral development among the leaders is fallible. It can easily go wrong. Maybe you don't have leaders with the right moral qualities. It treats li as an important guide to social interaction. But of course, sometimes the are unclear, and applying the V requires a lot of situational discretion or tact. Sometimes it's not obvious what to do. So it's not a completely reliable guideline. It advocates building unity by earning esteem, but sometimes people have biased attitudes and you can't earn their esteem. It advocates that the ruler be flexible, but sometimes a ruler that is flexible can be too flexible and can fail to enforce appropriate, consistent standards. Well, it's those sorts of problems that I'm talking about here that start to motivate the position of the people in the text that we end up calling the legalists. They want to find a way to eliminate those problems. So the inspiration for legalism that I want to emphasize is these are thinkers who are looking for a system that could govern effectively, maybe attaining some of the same ends as the Xúnzǐ text, but this system would achieve the sort of social coherence that you need while relying only on means that are 100% completely consistent, impartial, and reliable. And the suggestion is that the way to do that is to minimize or eliminate any element of administration that might be subject to human fallibility or human discretion. If we're concerned that the people administering the system might make mistakes or might be too flexible or might not be consistent enough in how they apply the standards, well, one way to try to remove that problem is to set up the system so that there's simply no role whatsoever for the individual judgment of the people who administer it. So maybe there's some way to approach government where we apply only fixed, unchanging standards, and we implement methods that we think are going to be 100% reliable. Now, legalism is kind of a funny term. Some people don't like using it. They think it's too general or it's inaccurate, or they're not happy because the English word legalism looks like it's referring to law. And of course, Fa is not only law. I'm kind of in the middle on that issue. I don't think it's a really good label, but I don't think it's a really terrible one either. I'll tell you how I'm going to use it. I'm going to use it as a label for a loosely overlapping family of views that we find in this collection of texts that typically hold that governance is a matter of mechanical operation of institutions organized around Fa, that the Fa are crafted to build and consolidate the power and the wealth of the state as personified in the autocratic ruler of the state, and that the only basic goods that are relevant to political theory are the stability and the strength of the state. And that's it. Now, why are they the only basic goods that are relevant? Well, because they're the only goods that are really impartial. Given that the state exists, almost by definition, it should seek stability and power and strength. And so they think the very existence of the state entails that minimal set of goods. And anything else, anything beyond that, is a reflection of someone's particular individual position about values. And we're going to try to eliminate all of that. So we end up with this very, very thin, narrow conception of value, stability, and strength. Okay, now some starting assumptions. The legalists are assuming that any political society has to maintain unity by drawing on some kind of shared disposition among the people to cooperate with the state. And the way that you attain that or manifest that sort of cooperation is by getting everybody to jointly observe shared norms and duties and rights and standards. And then if society is going to be stable, that observance has to be consistent. It has to be constant and impartial. And then that the way to do that is by setting up Fa and rigidly enforcing the application of Fa. And so accordingly, any other means of control or guidance or attaining unity is ruled out because none of those are sufficiently reliable. So if we look through the text, we find many, many different references to the role of Fa as being primarily to ensure impartiality. So we find lines like this. Among the functions of standards, none is greater than preventing bias. Among the functions of the prince, none is greater than preventing contention among the people. You have to attain consensus. The sagely prince relies on standards, not expertise. Managerial methods, not persuasion. Impartiality, not bias. The great Tao, not minor things. Standards are that by which the superior unifies the people and employs those below. Bias is that by which those below infringe on the standards and disrupt the ruler. So lines like this are very, very easy to find across that body of text. Okay, so Fa exists to attain impartiality. Here are a few key features that follow from that theoretical orientation. One is that amorality, the absence of any sort of moral value, is a basic feature of the system. It's not a bug, it's a feature. It's built in. It's absolutely necessary. Why is that? Well, if the moral status of the Fa were relevant in some way, that would introduce a potential source of authority outside of the system itself. Okay, and you can't have that. So if the Fa have to be morally justified, and I'm the ruler, you could question my justification for the Fa, morally speaking. So we have to eliminate morality as a source of justification or as a source of value, just cut it off. So Fa have to be determined by the ruler without accountability to any higher or external authority. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that the Fa can be absolutely arbitrary. We still have those basic goods of stability and the strength of the state. So they're supposed to be pragmatically effective as attaining stability and the strength of the state. But beyond that, there's no other external authority. And so that means that if the moral status of the Fa is not relevant, okay, then moral motivation is not relevant. The morality, moral values, ethical values are just not part of the picture. They have to be completely excluded. Now, why are they irrelevant? Well, they might interfere with conformity to the Fa. That's one problem. And then another problem is that they're not perfectly reliable. All right, so none of us is perfectly moral or perfectly virtuous. So appealing to moral motivation as a ground for attaining the kind of coordination and cooperation that we need in political life is not reliable enough. So we're not going to appeal to that at all. That's not part of the system. So of course, in rejecting that idea, the texts that reject that idea, if we're going to call them legalists, are rejecting, the prevailing common wisdom among the rule and the more, and probably a whole bunch of other people, that moral role modeling by the leadership is a key way of inspiring cooperation with the system. They want to completely reject that idea. And I would say, even in the Taoist texts, we find that idea. It's just that the role modeling is a very different kind of role modeling, and the content is very different. So they're going against basically the shared wisdom of almost all other political thinkers. Okay, so you've got no moral motivation. Well, that's why, of course, legalist texts assume that the only reliable form of motivation is what I call the motivational lowest common denominator, the most basic motivation that all human beings are guaranteed to have, and therefore is completely constant and reliable. So the only thing that we're going to assume about people is that, as Han Fei famously says, people have preferences. They have likes and dislikes. And since they have likes and dislikes, you can use rewards and punishments to control them. So we're just going to assume there are things that people like and dislike, and that's it. Lowest common denominator, assume nothing else. Okay, so given that lowest common denominator, we're going to try to develop a system in which the standards, the rewards, and the punishments all operate so clearly and precisely that they can be applied mechanically, like clockwork. without the need for any kind of skill or moral wisdom or discretion, specialized knowledge. We're going to try to eliminate all of that because all of that is potentially unreliable. So we try to eliminate all of that. So there's not going to be any role for expert judgment or discretion. All of those things introduce a risk of bias. We're also going to eliminate any role for delegation of authority. The machine has to function as a whole with all the power concentrated in the one figure at the top. Because the moment that we give anybody else in the system the authority to use their own discretion to decide how to apply the Fa, we're creating a different power center that's alienated from the system as a whole. And we're opening up the possibility of them applying that authority in a way that is biased, right? So we can't have that at all. No delegation of authority. And so people whose job it is to apply the standards can never use their own autonomous discretion to determine how to apply the standards. Okay? Now, this is a way in which we should understand that the whole concept of Fa is sometimes a little bit different from our contemporary concept of law. We see law as requiring interpretation. Right? We need judges to interpret how to apply the law in individual cases. Well, the idea here is, to the extent possible, eliminate the interpretations. Make it really, really obvious how to apply them so that the officials who enforce the standards are not what we would call a judge or a magistrate. Oops, sorry. They're more like a clerk, right? They're more like somebody who just, you want to go buy some rice, they put it on the scale, they say, "Ichim," and they charge you a price for the weight of the rice. They're not really applying any judgment whatsoever. Okay, so the idea is that the people who are enforcing the standards are more like a clerk. They're really just components in a mechanism that exists to sense the different kinds of cases and trigger certain sorts of responses to the cases. Okay, so that's a very condensed summary of some key features of this legalist response to the problem of Gong attaining what is somehow impartial and Chang consistent. So you've got this idea that we can fulfill those ideals by setting up a system in which discretion plays no role, expertise plays no role, it just functions kind of automatically. And you can see the beauty of that idea. You can see how that might be appealing, right? And Xúnzǐ very nicely helps us to see that that idea is completely crazy. It's a philosophical fantasy. It could never be realized in practice. Anybody who thinks they're going to realize it just doesn't understand what they're doing. And those are some of the fascinating ideas that we can extract for what Xúnzǐ has to say about this. Okay, I'm going to suggest that Xúnzǐ has a two-part critique of legalism. The first part is shared by some other texts. I think we can easily find similar ideas in Ruist Chunqiu. And this part, I think, is fairly obvious, and all of us on reading the legalist text kind of think this, it's sort of a response that many people are going to have, which is that the moral psychology in legalism is just too crude. It's so crude that it's actually self-defeating. And a number of early texts point out that since actually what's happening in the legalist system is that it's just very strongly reinforcing self-interest, the moment that people see that betraying the regime is in their self-interest, they will betray it right away, right? Because they've just been trained to pursue their own self-interest. And so Xúnzǐ says, if people do things for the sake of rewards and celebration, then when they see harm and injury, they're going to stop. That comes out of book 15, by the way, Yiping. If you're working on Xúnzǐ, be sure to pay due attention to that text. That's actually one of the most important political texts in Xúnzǐ. I know that when I was a student, people tended to look at the title and jump over it, but it's actually really important. Okay, so Xúnzǐ holds that attaining a kind of fundamental unity in a political society is achievable only through a kind of what I call moral reciprocity. The leadership treats the people according to shared moral values, and the people respond according to those same shared moral values. So if you're going to attain a deep sort of identification with the system and loyalty to the system, you have to do so by this kind of reciprocal, morally justified treatment of each other. So Xúnzǐ suggests that people conform to the Fa when they see that a ruler is demonstrating concern for their welfare and cultivating a shared commitment to moral values. So when people see that, conformity to the Fa is part of this broader package of a kind of communal project of attaining social welfare and jointly observing certain moral values, that's what really wins their loyalty. That's what gets them to support the system. Now, an interesting corollary of that point is that you can already see that for Xúnzǐ, Fa are going to be an expression of a kind of ethical culture, not the source of social political unity. So the source of social political unity is the shared values. Fa are an articulation of the shared values. Whereas on a legalist approach, the Fa themselves are supposed to create unity. Okay, so I'm not going to say too much about the psychological claims, except we can see that the psychological claims actually complement the points that Xúnzǐ makes about Fa. So here are these other points. The key claim, I think, that we find in Xúnzǐ is that Fa can function properly only through the guidance and judgment of morally worthy persons or exemplary persons. Now, one thing that's very fascinating about Xúnzǐ's critique of legalist ideas is that, well, when we read through Xúnzǐ, it's clear that Fa play a major role in Xúnzǐ's ethics and politics. They're every bit as important in Xúnzǐ as they are in legalist texts. And this is probably also a respect in which Xúnzǐ is influenced by Mojia, by the Mohists. But what we see in Xúnzǐ is pretty consistently discussions of the role of Fa are conceptually paired with discussions of the role of exemplary people in illustrating how to apply the Fa and guiding us in applying them. And that's why, famously in Siu Fu TANG, for example, you see these repeated references in Xúnzǐ to Shi Fa Zhe Fa, right? So it's always Shi and Fa. So you've got the person and you've got the standard paired conceptually. You can't have the one without the other. So given that key claim, what follows is that the legalist aim of attaining impartiality or constancy by excluding any role for personal discretion is just practically and conceptually incoherent and practically impossible. It's based on a misunderstanding of how the Fa work. Impartiality and consistency can be achieved only through the public, and I think an implication of what Xúnzǐ says is collective exercise of expertise in applying the Fa. Now, I think in Xúnzǐ, the two key points that support that stance are these. One is that the Fa simply cannot function without expert judgment. If you don't have expert judgment and you just have the standards, you're going to fail to apply them correctly. And we find remarks like this in Xúnzǐ. When you've got the gentleman present, even if you don't have a lot of standards, they're still sufficient to cover all the cases because people with expertise know how to interpret and extend them to new cases or cases that kind of fall between the categories. On the other hand, if you don't have the right people in place, even if you do have the standards, officials won't really understand how to apply them. And they'll be unable to respond to variations or fluctuations or changes in the situation. So if you've got somebody who's just trying to follow a rule book, but they don't have any expertise and they don't understand what the point of the rules is, Xúnzǐ says they're going to fail. It doesn't work that way. There's no such thing as a Fa that operates mechanically without the discretion of qualified experts. Now, if we think back to the Mohist introduction of the notion of Fa in early Chinese normative theory and ethical theory, right, the Mohists start talking about how, well, we can easily tell what's right and wrong because we've got the guiju. So just like the carpenter who wants to know whether or not it's a square corner, we take our tool, we put it down, and we say yes or no, shi fei is right or it's not right. Well, the Mohists are exaggerating, right? if you're trying to build a table and I say, oh, here, and I throw you the square, that doesn't mean you're now going to be able to build the table. You need the master carpenter to show you how to do it, right? Take the square and do this. So even in that very simple case, you need some expertise to know how to apply the fa. So fa are the tools for articulating and performing norm-governed practices, but they're going to function only in the hands of people who know how to perform those practices. So that's one point. And then the second point is that there's simply no fa that are going to cover all the cases that are out there. There are going to be new cases. There are going to be cases that are a little bit different from what had been anticipated by the people who developed the fa. And when we encounter these varying cases, we're going to need expert discretion and discussion to interpret and extend the application of the fa. Now, I have an interpretation of Xúnzǐ here that maybe some people might think is pushing the text a little too far, although I think I can defend it. But it's interesting. There's actually a line in the Guanzi that says to avoid bias, the fa cannot be open to discussion. I don't think I quoted the line here. I think I omitted it. Well, I think that in Xúnzǐ, we find a line that actually says almost the opposite. It actually says if the fa are not open to discussion, then we're going to neglect the cases that they don't cover. So Xúnzǐ seems to say, well, we've got all the standard cases, and then we've got some tricky, difficult cases. And when we have the tricky, difficult case, if we have a team of 3 officials who've been assigned to handle these cases, they need to talk about it. So the Guanzi idea was that you can't have people disputing your application of the rules if you're the ruler. The Xúnzǐ case, of course, is not saying, the line is not saying, oh, I invite all of society to discuss how to apply it. But it is saying that there's no one set way to do it. At least the experts have to be able to undertake a kind of open discussion about how to apply the fa in different cases. And then this is also an interesting contrast. Famously, everybody knows the Han Fei story about how officials must never overstep their duties as defined in the fa, right? So if the ruler falls asleep and you see that he's cold and it's not your job to put a robe on him, don't do it, or you might be punished when he wakes up, right? Okay, well, in the Xúnzǐ, we find this idea. If everybody just does their one job without any kind of communication, then things that are not covered by our narrowly defined job will fall through the cracks. They won't be covered. So he seems to be saying that officials with different duties will now and then notice something that's not covered by anyone's job, and they have to discuss it or point it out, or at least talk about it in order to find a way to cover these cases that otherwise might fall through the cracks. Okay, now, if we accept those ideas from Xúnzǐ, then we're reintroducing this problem of potential bias or error, because we're saying that there are a lot of people out there. Sorry, we're saying that other officials, experts in the system, have to be allowed to apply their personal discretion in determining how the fa apply in different cases. And as the legalists contend, if expert discretion of these, qualified people in the system is crucial to the application of fa, then the risk of error and bias reoccurs. Okay, so of course the legalists are right about that. There's going to be a risk of bias. How does Xúnzǐ handle the issue? Well, I think that the Xúnzǐ text acknowledges that this is a potential problem. But the problem is unavoidable. So what do? Well, you make sure that you employ qualified people. You insist that those people have to understand the purpose of the fa. They don't just mechanically apply them, they understand what the point is. You encourage open and critical discussion, maybe not among society as a whole, but at least among the officials. You encourage communication. You try to clarify the analogical basis for extending the fa to new cases. And Xúnzǐ emphasizes that you have to try to adjudicate fairly and neutrally. So the text is addressing those questions, and I think it's addressing them in the only possible way. It's acknowledging that this is a problem, it's a difficulty, but you can't solve it by just insisting on applying the fa mechanically. you can only solve it through these very common sense steps. Okay. I'll try to speed up a little bit, so I don't want to talk too long. I originally gave this talk and ended roughly around there. And then last month, when I gave the talk for the ICSP. Yeah, I had been chatting with Lisa Raples, who hosted that. And I said, so there's this discourse in later Chinese political thought where a lot of people are talking about these ideas. And she said, well, could you please talk about that a little? I kind of have a book in progress where I deal with these figures and try to go into this in a lot of detail. So we're not going to go into a lot of detail here. I'm just going to point out that as we move through the tradition of Chinese political thought, these issues that are highlighted in Xúnzǐ and in Xúnzǐ's criticism of legalism come up again and again. So I'll start with the Song Dynasty. The issue of the apt Fa and the need to train qualified people to apply the Fa becomes very prominent in the Song Dynasty. Well, Ansher is talking about it, for instance. And he says that the lasting insecurity of the realm is due to a failure to understand the Fa. And he traces part of the problem to, he says, we don't have the right Rencai in order to manage the application of the Fa. So that's just an example of how the issue comes up. People are very interested in it. If we look at a number of later political thinkers, I think we can extract 4 key points from their discussions. One is that there's a certain level of broad agreement with Xúnzǐ that persons or moral character are crucial to implementation of the Fa. So that's sort of a baseline representing a common sense opinion. But then they elaborate on that in various ways that Xúnzǐ does not. So one of the points that's made by way of elaborating on that is that if you've got really badly framed standards or laws or regulations, then even the best people can't overcome that problem. So although we agree with Xúnzǐ that persons are somehow more important than Fa, the way the Fa are formulated is important too. There's a balance between them. And then there's this interesting new idea, which is not present in earlier writing, in Xúnzǐ, that excessive reliance on Fa to the exclusion of input from other people is itself a kind of bias. That's a very interesting idea, kind of ironic, given the initial motivation for the view. And then what I think is articulated very clearly is that the virtuous persons are crucial because the Fa themselves just are not fundamental. They're expressions of values. And so it's the grasp of the value which is actually fundamental, not the articulation of the value, although the articulation is very important. So just looking through some texts for interesting examples of opinions on these issues. Hu Hong says that if Fa are established and regulations are fixed, but you don't have the right people in place, then they can't be implemented. Chen Liang, who is very important on this issue. As you can see, he's more or less directly quoting Xúnzǐ here. He says, I've heard of using the right people to implement the Fa, but I've never heard of letting the Fa implement themselves. If you don't have the right people, they won't be implemented properly. So you can see the Xúnzǐan influence. Huang Zongxi very nicely points out what he calls Fa Wai Zhi Yi. So he says, you've got the Fa of the former kings, but within these Fa, there's this Fa Wai Zhi Yi. And if you don't grasp that, then you can't really carry out the Fa. And to grasp that, you have to have Qi Ren, you have to have the right people. Okay, but Hu Hong and Huang Zongxi, this is interesting. Both of them quote Xúnzǐ and claim to be disagreeing with him. I think it's questionable whether or not they're really disagreeing. Maybe they're just sort of, revising a little bit. But Hu Hong says that Fa are like a boat, people are like the helmsman driving the boat. If the boat's damaged and the rudder is broken, then even if you have great skill, you're not going to be able to cross. So the fa themselves are also important. You can't just rely on the person. And Xúnzǐ takes himself to be directly contradicting Xúnzǐ, and he says, 有治法而后有治人. So he actually turns it around. But what he means by that is that if you've got fa that are really, really badly formulated, so that even with the right people in place, they're not free to somehow improve the situation, then they're not going to be able to achieve anything. Here's an interesting, ironic claim that focusing on fa excessively or exclusively is itself a form of bias. Chen Liang says fa are impartial patterns. If you try to make the fa implement themselves, that's a selfish attitude. It's not an impartial attitude. Basically, the point that he seems to be getting at is that only a ruler who is obsessed with maintaining control himself without sharing power in any way would be that obsessed with rule by fa. And that he takes to be actually an expression of a kind of selfish bias. Fang Xiaoru makes that point very clear. He says that somebody who relies on the fa excessively, what they're doing is casting aside all the realm's common likes and dislikes and following the single standard of fa, which is based on their selfish intentions. Okay, Gu Yanwu, very interesting position. He seems to be assuming that ideally power is distributed throughout the government. And so the legalists claim that power should be concentrated in the one person at the top of the pyramid, and the fa are just a way of enforcing that power or applying that power. He sees that as a misconception. Actually, the way it's supposed to work is power is distributed throughout the government and exercised through a combination of the fa and the discretion of all the officials who are in charge of applying the fa. So he thinks that focusing on fa alone is a result of an incompetent ruler trying to concentrate all the power in just his hands. Xúnzǐ says, as the fa become increasingly tight, disorder arises within the fa itself. What he calls fei fa zhi fa, fa that fail to be actual fa. And he traces back to kings who fail to overcome their own selfish desire for benefit. These are the people who create these faulty sorts of fa. Okay, and then that fourth point, where they're explicitly articulating the idea that fa are an expression of values. We find Hu Hong saying that the system of fa is itself a manifestation of Dao and De. It's not itself fundamental, it's a way of expressing Dao and De. We find Fang Xiaoru saying, if those who establish the fa are not those who know the Dao of benevolence and rightness, they'll be unable to establish appropriate fa. If those who preserve the fa don't understand the intentions behind them, then they're going to be unable to maintain them properly. Gu Yanwu tells us that fa are something you can't abandon, you have to apply them, but they're not the means of bringing about good order. The means of bringing about good order is still a kind of moral reform. I think that this one I've actually looked at already. But he's saying with the wrong person in place, fa, if you formulated them properly, they won't be able to mislead. Okay, let me say a few things about what I see as the significance of this critique. Now, we understand that in these texts, fa cover any system or code or institution that's organized according to regulations or guidelines. Any kind of formal institutional benchmarks or standards. So part of the emphasis of this long discussion in the history of Chinese political thought are that fa are an expression of moral culture. They're a means of embodying and reinforcing and guiding the practice of certain shared customs, shared values and norms. And the emphasis in the Ruist tradition is that any system of fa is only as reliable as the judgment and the moral character of the people who administer it. So if you don't have the right persons, then the fa will be inert. They don't proceed of themselves. So for example, if you've got a constitution that's well formulated and it appears to embody rule of law and civil rights, his Xúnzǐ tradition of discussion implies that, well, no matter how well you formulate it, it's in a sense empty unless it's administered by competent officials who understand the point of the formulations in the Constitution. And fa can be neglected, or they can actually be abused unless they're enforced by, as Xúnzǐ would say, someone who grasps the values or the intentions behind them. So the idea of trusting in institutions without seeing the interplay between institutions and the ethical culture of those who uphold or enforce the institutions is actually a way of opening a path toward abuse of those institutions. So as somebody who, as a young person, grew up in North America, I would say that the political culture in which I grew up had much too much faith in the idea that institutions would just automatically carry us along in a way that ensured justice, for instance. And so that Ruist point that no, it only ensures justice if the people in place applying those institutions genuinely are committed to an understanding of justice that was shared by the people who established the institutions and is shared across society. So a direct implication then is that the functioning of institutions such as the law may actually be much more fragile than we tend to assume. So as I was saying, when I was a young person, I thought that the functioning of certain institutions was very, very reliable and wasn't something you had to worry about. Now I worry about it all the time, right? Institutions don't run themselves. The mere fact that they are there doesn't ensure that their original purpose and the content of them will actually be applied properly. With the wrong persons in place, they can be abused, they can lose their efficacy. And we might say that not only the content of particular fa, but the whole idea of rule by standards or rule of law is open to interpretation. If you don't have the right people doing the interpretation, what you and I might treasure as rule of law or rule of certain sorts of institutions could collapse. So those points, I would say, raise a whole bunch of difficult questions for us to consider. We have this widely shared theme in the tradition of Chinese political thought that moral character is a basic qualification for political office. And it may seem very impractical, and it may seem a strange way of exporting an ancient political ideal into contemporary discourse to start talking about that. But I think that Xúnzǐ and Discourse on Fa helps us to see that that issue is unavoidable. That even though we may be dealing with contemporary rule of law, for instance, we can't neglect the importance of moral character, broadly construed, in the stability and reliable functioning of what we think of as rule of law. And there's this ongoing question that we have to ask, which is whether or not ethical character can really outbalance material self-interest in such a system, or how we can ensure that we train and recruit officials with the right sort of moral character, and what the content of that moral character is supposed to be. And all of these may seem kind of impractical questions, but one implication of the Xúnzǐ discourse is that they're questions that we can't afford to neglect, even though there are no easy answers to them. That's a good point to stop at.
Okay, thank you. Floor is open, so yeah.
This is a very witty comparison of philosophers from a long time ago, and then the application to today's legalists, the jurisprudence and debate in political philosophy. But I wonder whether if we think in terms of system and that the legal system, the governing system could be functioning and malfunctioning. And while functioning, there could be still a state of normal and normal state. So among these four things, would the legalist have in mind that given the functioning system, even at an abnormal state, we can just let it run and it will return to normal. But Xúnzǐ would have more about the malfunctioning state. Maybe it has to do with a kind of disorder that would reach chaos and the dynasty, the emperor being threatened, the sovereignty. I think would this be at the background of their mind that in the context that they are in, that they are thinking about different things, whether we need a manual override or not. Yeah. Does it speak to?
Okay, so you're saying
that they have different concerns.
Different concerns.
Yeah. One is about the system being integral at
Right.
all, but sometimes there are disorder at the citizen level. And on the other hand, it could be a case in which you need the emperor or the judges need to make discretion because it's outside the system that's already been designed to handle the problem.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Okay, so I think the taxonomy of different possibilities where you might have disorder or problems is more complicated than that. It's probably very complicated.
Yeah.
And that some of it is covered by these sources, like someone like Xúnzǐ, even though he doesn't go into enough detail, right? But you can see that he is at least considering a case where you might have, let's say it's a law, you might have a law that is appropriately formulated, but it's not being applied properly. Or you might have a law that was appropriately formulated in some prior historical situation and now it's not relevant anymore, and it ought to be reformed. And then you might have some that are they're formulated very, very badly in some way, or they're actually abusive in some way. And so if I understand you, you're saying, okay, we can imagine some of the time they're addressing the case where you've got an appropriate FA, but you don't have the right people in place who are applying it appropriately. And then when you said override, were you thinking of a case where the FA is not appropriate at all and it needs to be?
You can't determine what the decision.
Yeah.
What if the law that Hang Feite, for example, envisioned that it would just let it run is it possible? And because there's sometimes when there are things that happen that's outside the system that's not been described what to do.
Yeah.
And that's when of course, the complexity is relative to the one that's governing and what has happened before. So
right.
Whether it's in the statute.
Right.
It's been written.
Right. So that's one of the fundamental points in Xúnzǐ where I think that in the history of world philosophy of law, we need to be giving Xúnzǐ a lot of credit. That Xúnzǐ is a very important figure here, and I'm not sure that has been recognized. And so one of the very deep points that Xúnzǐ is making is that there's no way to formulate the FA so they're going to cover all the cases in advance. It just can't be done. Partly because the situation there'll be changes. Partly because no matter how you draw the categories, the types of cases, there are going to be a few things that fall in the middle, right? So you've got at least those two reasons. And because of that, you need the expertise in order to extend the FA to these cases, right? And so there's the famous line in Xúnzǐ about 以类聚, right? So the way of making that analogical projection to the new cases is going to depend on the expertise of the people who are charged with applying those FA. So that basic point, I think that's just like a truism that's unavoidable.
Yeah, I think that in open system, there's always outruns, even in lots of the time, the evidence underdetermined. So what we have in the past. Yeah,
right. But that Xúnzǐ point is that's not calling attention to a flaw or a fault in the FA, but rather just calling attention to a basic conceptual point about the application of any benchmark. That's why I think that conceptually it's such an interesting, it deserves a lot of credit. It might seem obvious to us, but this is the earliest text I know of that actually says that, right? and that isn't so much a manual override as a way of calling attention to how Fa actually work. That there's all, there are limits, that it's never going to be obvious in every case how it works. You're going to need expertise. And then what I think is really nice in Xúnzǐ, at least as I read it, is this acknowledgement that extending it in cases like that, in some cases, the best way to do it is to have a discussion among the experts. I think that's also very interesting. Yeah.
Well, a follow-up question, if I may. So how, because when in a legalist tradition, it seems to be talking about the consequence of harmony and having a stable society. But for the Ruist perspective, the harmony seems to be intrinsic to the people's way of life.
Harmony seems to be
intrinsic. Is it? Or because I seem to you seem to be getting at, maybe you can clarify whether the 治 what I mean is the stability of being under control. I think that's not a good translation, but or maybe just rule of law. Whether there's something intrinsically valuable to having that in a society.
In Xúnzǐ.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, my reading of Xúnzǐ, I don't know if it's exactly the same as yours or not, but to me, for Xúnzǐ, 治, right? 政治的治 is a basic good.
Oh.
But I think Xúnzǐ has a very strong, thick interpretation of what that is, much thicker than yours and mine might be, for instance. I also think specifically in terms of Xúnzǐ, so we're all familiar with, 心恶说, so we're all familiar with this, people's nature is bad. And we're all familiar with this very kind of pessimistic moral psychology in Xúnzǐ. And I think if we look at, I'm not sure how to fit this into an overall interpretation of Xúnzǐ, but I think that if we look at some of the remarks in Yiping, for instance, they fill out a Xúnzǐan moral psychology and make it much more complex. So, on the one hand, there are texts in Xúnzǐ that say, if you just let people follow their xing, they act very badly. Okay. But then we've got political texts in Xúnzǐ that says, if you want to win people's loyalty, treat them well, they naturally tend to respond in a positive way. That's a much more kind of optimistic view of human psychology than we find in the parts about xing. And I don't see this as necessarily contradictory, because the xing discourse is a very specific discussion aimed at certain specific claims that are very optimistic about xing. And setting those claims aside, I don't think Xúnzǐ ever wanted to talk about xing. It's because other people talked about it, so he had to talk about it. But setting those claims aside, we have these other claims about, and this is interesting, it's not individual moral psychology, it's group moral psychology. It's societies, communities, by which, if the people recognize that the rulership is treating them according to certain moral values, they will tend to cooperate because they actually value that way of treating people. And they respect that in some way. And that's an idea that we also find in Moism. This reciprocity between the ruler and the people. It's also in Guanzi, very early material in Guanzi. So it's a pretty widely shared early Chinese political view that you can win solidarity by treating people well. It's common sense, right?
Great for your sharing.
I think first of all, thank you so much. Right, it was lovely. My question to you is coming from an adjacent discourse in the Xúnzǐ, the one about ritual in relationship to Li, right? In this case, in relationship to Fa. And so one of the, I think, interesting features of the Xúnzǐ is, right, that it takes on almost kind of a Zhuangzian disrespect for texts. And so when he talks about rituals, right, it says like, well, these vulgar rules, right, they all care about how ritual is written in texts. Mm-hmm. They don't get it. If you really want to understand ritual, you look at the current sages and their actualizations of ritual in the here and now. That's where you actually learn how to be a properly ritualized person, right? So this is kind of discourse where texts are criticized, but the
the people's, right, the seeing, the performance of ritual is actually described as something positive.
Right.
So my question to you is, did you see when you looked at the way how fast this is described in the Xúnzǐ, the same kind of pattern, that rituals are basically downplayed far when they're associated with textual recordings?
Yeah.
And what you tell me, it sounds like that would be the case.
Yeah, I'm
not sure, you know, I never looked into it. So I'm just wondering whether you see the same kind of criticism of stable, right, Chang forms of laws that are manifested or fixed in written forms. And because it seems like he wants to go and say like, no, right, look at how laws are performed in a state, in a good form. That's how you learn how to be.
I'm not sure what parts of Xúnzǐ you're thinking of. I mean, I think that Xúnzǐ is quite deeply attached to very elaborate rituals, but you know, in a way that it is very difficult for us to really grasp, because culturally it's so different from our world.
Yeah.
You know, there's two ways of reading Xúnzǐ. One is, if you read what Xúnzǐ is saying about the ritual in a rather abstract way, then it's very, very plausible. And then if you read it in a very concrete way, the specific things he's talking about, it seems to us very alien, very hard to sympathize with. But setting that aside, you know, regarding the underlying issue you're raising, of course, you know, the obvious thing to keep in mind is that for Xúnzǐ, Li is Fa, right? Fa zhi da fen. So you know, the Li are one example, and maybe the most important example of Fa. Yeah. So everything he says about Fa should apply to the Li also. And I don't have any particular passages in mind when I say this, but I think we can easily, if we read Xúnzǐ, we can easily imagine finding a place where he criticizes somebody for mechanically and robotically performing the Li by the textbook, rather than understanding the underlying point of it and performing in a way that manifests the underlying value of the point. So I don't have a particular, I'm not thinking of a particular paragraph that says just that, but it seems to me that, you know, in looking through the Xúnzǐ, that's something that I might expect to find there.
Yeah.
You know, it's a very natural thing for.
But did you find it with the Fa too? That's basically like, you know, for ritual, I mean, I don't have it in my head. I would have to pull out my computer, right?
So the closest thing with the Fa is that line about, I mean, it's not really rejecting the textbook of Fa, but it's saying that this part, is it this part? Yeah, that right, 不知法之义，而正法之术者，虽薄礼是必乱。So even if you have a lot of experience, if you don't understand 法之义, and you just take the shu, and of course it's always difficult to interpret the shu, but it's something like doing it, you know, by the numbers, by the technique. Right? 那个数字的数跟艺术的术经常是互用的 right? So, you know, there he seems to be saying if you don't really get the point and you're just following the rules, then you're going to mess it up. Not exactly what you were saying, but related to it.
It's kind of close though. Anyway, it's not actualized to the situation in this case. Thanks.
Yeah, just a reminder that for online audience, if you have a question, then type in the chat box.
Do we need to turn on the chat or something?
I think if you show up, right? If there's a chat, right?
Question. Well, hi, Chris. Well, firstly, it's really good to see you back here and how are you? Okay, well, it's one question about legalism. You have given us an outline, the theoretical framework of legalism, and I'm asking myself, okay, why would someone say be committed to that framework? Now, one important component is about the lowest common denominator in psychology, right? So basically, we have two motivations. We like rewards, we hate punishments.
Mhm.
Well, okay, yeah, I agree with that. But well, isn't it just obviously too simplistic to think that this is a complete account
Yeah.
of the lowest common denominator?
Yeah.
But because you just said that, well, it's just common sense, right? People, well, can go to great length, make huge sacrifice to their self-interest, say at least to protect those who are closer to their parents, etc. Right. So I'm just wondering whether, say, the legalists have given some argument in support of that, well, what I take to be
Yeah.
a very, very simplistic psychological view.
Yeah, so I think, so I don't think that any legalist text assumes that people's moral psychology actually is that simple, right? I think their position is that we want this 100% reliable system that can never go wrong, right? And if I rely on your goodwill or your moral conscience or your commitment to our shared project or your aesthetic sense, all of those things are unreliable. The only thing that's absolutely reliable is your fear of pain. And so, you know, if I set up a system on which disobedience is punished hugely disproportionately by brutality, then you will cooperate no matter what, right? And I think that's just what they're thinking. It's a matter of what's completely reliable. Everything else is unreliable except that. And then I think that their critics, including the Ruist and the Xúnzǐ, see that by reducing psychology to that and saying that's what's reliable, they've neglected the fact that people's resentment of them and people's commitment to other values actually are, you know, as strong as their fear of pain.
Yeah.
And so they, you know, people will be constantly looking for the opportunity to rebel because they've been forced into this, you know, very, very narrow moral psychology and being treated basically like animals, right? So I think the really fascinating point that's in both Xúnzǐ and the Ruist is that the legalists are in effect saying the most reliable thing to do is to treat people according to this very simple moral psychology, and they're wrong about that. That's not reliable because people don't want to cooperate with that, right? That actually sparks resentment and self-interest aimed at defying the system, right? So the intriguing thing is that you've got somebody like Xúnzǐ saying, no, actually winning their loyalty through a kind of morally appropriate treatment is more reliable, even though it's not 100% reliable. There is no 100% reliable, but it's more reliable than making them hate you, right? And I think that's also a kind of a brilliant point to make. You know, that it may look like this sort of moral identification is unreliable, but actually it's pretty reliable.
Yeah, I agree totally. That's a good point. It's just I'm wondering, you know, shouldn't have the legalists anticipated that objection because well, they are making a very, very strong psychological claim, assumption, right?
Yeah.
And you better have some good argument to back that up. And I'm just wondering whether they
the argument that you see them making again and again is that this is the only thing that's reliable.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I mean, if you say, well, wouldn't they have anticipated those objections and couldn't they see the weakness in their own argument? And I don't think they were very good philosophers.
Okay.
So no, I don't think they saw it. Yeah.
I have two questions that I just simply want to know and hear what you think about it. And the first one is, what do you think is when you talk about Xúnzǐ is quite different from what we know. So according to your judgment, do you think Xúnzǐ is Confucius or just legislate? That means is legislate. The second question is the Fa is more applicable to modern Western society or Oriental society? Yes.
So the first one is you're saying you're thinking that there's some
yes.
There's some orthodox conception of rule.
Yeah.
So I just reject the idea that there's any narrow orthodox tradition of rule. I think it's a much broader tradition.
Because we think that Xúnzǐ is Confucius, and because he's always advocate respect the emperor. So
I think of Xúnzǐ as rule, absolutely.
yes.
But I think of the rule tradition as being, somewhat pluralistic. It's quite broad.
So yeah, so according, if I want to know that, what do you think? He is Confucius or legislative? It's just like you want to.
Xúnzǐ. Well, I would say it's rule. but-
You can say.
Yeah, but the Ruist tradition is quite broad. Yeah.
Okay.
And then the other point is, right, so if someone is thinking that, a long discourse about a concept of law as a unifying factor in political society is somehow distinctive of modern Western political theories, starting maybe with Pufendorf, figures like that in Europe, then this tradition of text shows us that understanding of the development of what you might think of as a philosophy of law is much too narrow and culturally biased, and that there's this very rich tradition of discussion of a concept of fa, which is broader than law but can include law in the Chinese tradition. And if we neglect it, then we have an impoverished view of the history of human discourse about these concepts, basically. And so that, this material deserves attention from everyone. And if someone wants to say that, in Chinese culture, there's no concept of rule of law, well, maybe not by that name, but there's this very rich, very long discourse about the concept of fa. Right? And no one can say that this is somehow not Chinese. Those are the finest minds in Chinese history talking about it, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question. I wonder, well, in a potential response from legalism, maybe is they are presuming different form of government in the sense that they have different conception of the boundary of government. That might be one possible response. That is, while Xúnzǐ might presuppose a sort of more comprehensive government, maybe the legalist is advocating for a more limited form of government. So the sort of like institutional order they are asking for might be different in that sense from the one advocated.
What do you think the scope of it would be?
Because in that sense, of course, it's partly motivated by the association of legalists with a broadly Taoist tradition. So there has been a quite an intimate relationship between the two.
Okay.
So maybe the legalist is presuming that they're not removing the social and moral aspect of society, but they're just saying that imposing a universal or unitary political order on top of that, diversify the social and moral order. That might be a potential response.
I think that's like the most charitable way to try to develop their ideas.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. I think in their texts themselves, there's no hint of them doing that. But I tend to read, like when I work with Hanfei, I tend to like not treat the Taoist stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, because I think that the other stuff just doesn't connect with it in any way.
Yeah.
And I think that in the actual practice of these societies, of a legalist governed society, the scope of the fa is really, really broad.
Yeah.
Right. It would cover things like, what you could do for your employment. It would cover things like your sexual and marital relations. It would cover, it would be quite totalitarian, I think. Maybe the text to look at to really consider that deeply is the Yan Tie Lun, which in a fuller treatment of this, I would talk about that. Because there's in the Yan Tie Lun, there's this fascinating direct conversation between people representing a more legalist stance and people representing a more Ruist stance. And to some extent also Xúnzǐ, since it actually has a representative of legalism talking to supposedly Xúnzǐ, it's interesting to look at that. So there's kind of there's a positive way, there's a positive spin that you can put on some of the legalist discussions, where you take them as making this interesting contribution to understanding how to organize, social institutions in that way. And I think that's potentially a very constructive way to work with the material. Although I'm not sure it's historically accurate. I mean, we can have a number of projects that we do. One is the historically accurate interpretation, and the other is what do we want to do with these ideas? And these are both interesting projects.
Yeah. Of course, I also sense some tension within that suggestion, so limited form and actual practice of legalism. But I'm also thinking maybe there's another question of a pre-imperial and post-imperial situation in China. Maybe because all the legalist texts that we have actually are pre-imperial.
Except Yantianle.
Yeah, Yantianle, but but Yantianle is, we can only classify it in legalist because of the pre-imperial legalist text.
Okay.
Right? And I'm thinking that maybe in the pre-imperial period, the social and the political condition are simply quite different from the post-imperial.
Okay, so you're thinking that like much of Han Fei is addressing a very disorderly situation and advocating methods of imposing order on it.
And part of, and also about you're talking about more elaborate one. I can imagine it might be a sort of like within the city, the state, but you are free to move in or out of the state, just like the Duchen and the Du, and you can just go into the countryside if you don't like that.
Yeah. But
within because of the need to maintain a social order, unitary order, then you need to obey some very strict rules. So that might be one plausible. I'm not confident to how plausible it is.
What led me into this material, I started working on this because I wanted to teach a class on traditional Chinese political philosophy. And I spent a lot of time just reading everything. And what struck me about it is really interesting is that, as I said, when I studied legalism, there was this formulaic way of teaching it based on those key concepts. And none of my teachers or the books I read at the time ever talked about Gong and Si. But here I am reading this stuff. It's like, no, what they really care about is this Gong Si. That's really what's driving it. And so if you think about it that way, then the legalist texts are very obviously one voice or a set of voices participating in a broad discourse at that time, where they're concerned with this idea of Gong versus Si, which is philosophically quite an interesting idea. And so that's a way of reading them as quite constructive and making a positive philosophical contribution, even though Xúnzǐ would say, yeah, but their solution just conceptually is incoherent. It doesn't work.
A short comment, because the two of you were like, oh, of course, right? Like Xúnzǐ's organization makes much more sense than Han Fei's, right? I think it depends on who you're talking to. If your goal is to generate a happy society, a society that feels good,
sure,
absolutely, there's no question, right?
Yeah.
But the Han Fei was not written for us.
No,
it was written for a ruler who wants to keep his job.
Absolutely.
And for them, if you ask Elon Musk, for example, or like Duterte in the Philippines, or some other figures, whether they prefer the Han Fei's organization of rule of law in this case, or the Confucian vision here, right, of a moralized talk. I'm not sure Elon Musk, as a person who is powerful in this case, right, in a smaller environment, would say, "Oh yeah, I go with Xúnzǐ here, absolutely." Right? So I think I think there's a certain element where Han Fei oftentimes gets a kind of bit ridiculed, because if we take the model for real, right, it's just gruesome. Just awful, right? Like for everybody else involved. But I think the goal was again not to make people happy, right? And I think in that regard, there's a certain element to it, I think, where we sometimes have to be careful. They don't talk about He or something, like they talk about zhi, right? And zhi doesn't mean people are happy. necessarily. In a Confucian context, it might, but in other contexts, it just means people are getting killed on the streets. You know, if you buy something, right? I mean, they won't cheat you on your money,
right?
And some kind of other basic mechanisms.
Yeah.
I think that sometimes for me, when I see these two put next to each other, that the kind of more realistic reading,
Yeah,
because that's perhaps how we would wish that society should look like, is sometimes given more credit, I think, than it sometimes.
So in the legalist writings that we find in the Guanzi are maybe a little bit more oriented toward discursive give and take with other positions, and possibly that's because they're coming out of the Jixia intellectual environment where they're talking to each other. And Hanfei is a bit more of kind of a guidebook for a ruler, right? And thank you very much for reminding us that, you know, we can talk about this as a matter of philosophical debate, and then we can also talk about the actual historical conditions, right? So we all see that in Hanfei, a major concern is I'm the ruler holding all this power, and everybody is trying to take my power away from me. And one way to protect myself is to insist on this very rigid mechanical system. I can never delegate authority to anybody else, because the moment I delegate authority to them, they will use it against me.
And stab me in the back.
Yes, they'll look for the opportunity to stab me in the back, or they would build their own power center, right? And that will fragment the system.
Which people did, right? I mean, like, people got stabbed.
Absolutely, right? And that's why we have like all these great historical dramas that we can watch on TV or whatever. So historically, that's an interesting way of looking at it and saying, look, the reason that the text is focusing on this is that it's addressing these very practical issues of protecting your power. And, you know, unfortunately, we don't have like direct lines between what's being said in the text and historical events, but we can see that that's sort of the background scenario for some of the discussion. And then, you know, I think we can interpret the text in multiple ways all the time. And that is part of the richness of the text. So then the philosophical issue is that these texts are claiming the most stable, you know, the way to protect your power, or the most stable way of organizing society, is this legalist way. And then the interesting issue that we were talking about is that, well, the Lü Shu Chunqiu and Xúnzǐ disagree. Yeah. They say, no, openly talking about moral values is actually more stable. And I guess that's an empirical claim that we could look into. I'm on their side. I think it's more likely that that's going to work, because they're saying people's actual moral psychology is very complicated. So the way to build a stable society is to acknowledge the complexity of their moral psychology and take that, you know, into account in how you're organizing the society. But that's an interesting issue. So their claim then is not, oh, you know, it's obviously true that our account of psychology is right, and what the legalists are doing is somehow impractical or ignoring human moral psychology. The underlying argument is that no, they want stability, but we think you actually get greater stability this way. It's an interesting debate.
No, but I think in smaller systems, like American capitalism, for example,
yeah,
it would be interesting to look into sometimes, not like states, right, but like smaller systems that seem to me oftentimes work far more closely to what a legalist system would look like sometimes than what a Confucian system looked like. And they work relatively well. I mean, if you think about Silicon Valley, right? I mean, like, people sell their souls for money, right? I mean, like the working environment there is horrible. I mean, like, they work 16, 18 hours, right? And like, if they don't, they get kicked out right away.
Sure.
I mean, they get paid well, right? But I mean, there's a lot. So there's a certain kind of element where you think, you know, some of the legalist stuff in a smaller scale functions much better than
on a smaller scale.
On a smaller scale, right? Then perhaps, like, when you think of it, like, it's kind of in a Tianxia type of.
Because I was going to mention the Hanfei critique of Ruism, right? So the Hanfei critique of Ruism is that, you know, the Hanfei critique of Ru and Dao is that in a very small scale society, the Taoist ideal of I just influence you through my character might actually work. And then when society gets bigger, the Ruist ideal of I influence you through these moral teachings
Doesn't work anymore.
might actually work. And Han Fei says, but now society is so big that none of those will work. The only way to manage it is through institutions, right? Now, to that step, that seems a very reasonable position.
Yeah.
Right, that seems quite convincing. And then another interesting thing is, think of something like political liberalism. So, you know, we could step in for Han Fei and say, oh, well, now in this big society, we can't assume a consensus on values anymore. So we need to rely on institutions, right? And so then maybe we should give the legalists some credit for that point, except that they go so far in the opposite direction. Maybe that helps to reflect again how institutions are never value-free, which is the whole Xúnzǐ point, right? That the idea of a value-free institution that assumes nothing other than you have preferences is a conceptual myth, basically. It can't actually exist.
Yeah, maybe a quick comment about, I think it's right that Han Fei's texts are mainly for the ruler, but there also is mainly about Shu, actually, about techniques that is for the ruler, but for Fa, I think in the Han Fei text, it makes quite clear that Fa is mainly for the official and ordinary people.
Yeah, to apply to them.
Yeah, to apply to them, and it function quite differently from that of Shu.
Yeah.
And that's also one reason I'm thinking the pre-imperial and the post-imperial are quite different, because the pre-imperial period, the ruler is actually quite limited in power. He has to contest with all these official powerful families. And then there are also this quite unruly ordinary people. So it's quite, I think this whole situation quite different before and after.
Before and after.
Qin.
Yeah.
Han.
When you get to the Han Dynasty.
Yeah. But it's a lot of worthwhile for exploration and investigation, and I look forward to the book.
So I mean, I could write that book, but then I personally am always conscious of the limitations of my own expertise, and so I mean, I think something helpful that you're articulating there is that a really full understanding of this material is going to involve a lot of historical understanding that personally I think I don't have. I have a very shallow, understanding in that area. But to really understand what's going on, it would be good to fill in a very rich historical picture about the context in which these ideas are being presented, and therefore what are the problems that they're intended to solve, and sometimes might those problems not be fully articulated in the text themselves.
Yeah, and could have another companion to that how we call a historical treatment.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, there's a guy at SLUP, his name is Filippo Marsili, and he works on punishment and law in the Western Han, so largely finances type of stuff, this and stuff. So it would be interesting, right? Because you're saying like that the situation changes so drastically. On one hand, it doesn't change. On the other hand, it changes quite drastically. To have yours as a kind of a not companion, but like as the other side of the coin. To see like these two parts, right? Like how much changes actually in these conceptualizations of Fa. I think would be quite interesting in that context.
Sometimes, especially in the later material, when they're talking about Fa, it's really hard to figure out what it is. What are they talking about exactly? And I always look through it looking for examples. Can they give us some examples? Because the concept gets very broad.
You make a very clear definition today. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think time is almost up. So thanks for attending our presentation.
Thank you. And thank you very much for the discussion. Very helpful discussion.
Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Now I'm really sleepy.
You need to take some rest. So your wife is not here yet?
My wife arrived a day ago.
Yeah.
And she's asleep right now.
Okay. So you mean when she's
I think a little
you need
bit
to
doing some very naughty things.
Okay.
Yeah, so